thank everybody for listening in to another installment of What's Your Promise? And if you haven't heard this show before, the whole idea is to really focus on the power of making a promise. And that's the key message, is that there's a real unique power in making a promise in your life, turning goals into promises. I talk about that quite a bit. And I sum up the power with these 4 sentences, and I just want to share that with if you haven't heard this before, the listeners. The 4 sort of mantra-like sentences I like to use basically sums it all up. Make a promise, keep your word, change your life, transform the world. That kind of boils it all down into a nice, almost aphorism that you can remember. The key part of it, obviously, is you got to keep your word, but you can change your life with this. And if millions of people do what I'm suggesting, I think there's going to be a real good chance of transforming the world in a positive direction by increasing the level of integrity and by helping people to achieve what they want to achieve in their life. And just to give people a quick background, I won't go into a lot of detail here. Hopefully you've heard 1 or 2 of these shows before. If you haven't, by way of background, I'll just share this. The reason I'm into this, the reason I'm actually talking about the power of making a promise, is that I made a promise to my mother. This was some years ago. I made a promise to my mother on her deathbed, literally, that I would finish writing a book that she and I had been discussing for a couple of years. I had some great ideas, and she thought they were terrific. She was encouraging me. And I decided I'm going to make a promise to her. I'm going to finish this book, and I will dedicate it to her memory. We both knew at the time that she would not live to see the dedication or the book published. I was still in the middle of it. But her face lit up, and she was really excited. She said, "You do that, Matthew. You do that." And obviously, when you make a promise like that to your mother, and she encourages you to do it, you know you have to do it. Failure is not an option. Now it's my mission and my purpose and my passion now to share this power as much as I can, to spread the word about the power of making a promise to more and more people, millions of people, through books and keynotes and seminars, a program like this, What's Your Promise, trying to get people who have made promises to talk about the power of making a promise. So that all by way of background. I don't want to make this into a long soliloquy. I want to bring Chris in here now, but I'm sure we'll go back and forth a little bit, Chris, on this some of these topics I just raised, and we'll have a little opportunity to get your opinions and your thoughts about the power of making a promise. Now, what I would like to say about Chris, and we don't have to do a long introduction, but Chris is a fascinating fellow. I've had the pleasure of reading a lot of his materials online, and he's got several areas. He's got a book that he's working on and coming out with fairly soon with a really intriguing title called Think Without the Box, and I want to get more from Chris about what that is. He also has a website, I think it's the URL, it's inscribeyourlife.com, but he's got spiritual short stories. That's one of his areas of expertise. That's what he's famous for. So I want to hear a lot more about all of that from Chris, and we're going to be talking about a promise he made, which I found really moving and very touching, and we'll talk a little bit more about the promise that Chris made. So, Chris, I know you're there, and you're patiently listening to all this. Why don't you share with the audience, at least in just a few words, what the promise was that you made, and we'll be talking more about that, and then we'll get into a little bit more about your background. But I just want to sort of tee up the promise itself so we have give people a sense of what it is we'll be talking about. What promise did you make, Chris?
Well, at the time, I didn't even think it was a promise because it was so implicit in my experience that it wasn't until I shared your work with somebody close to me that they pointed out this promise that I had made. And the promise was to devote myself to my son, to really be there, to keep him at the center of my life, and to raise him to be a phenomenal, outstanding human being. And when I say phenomenal, outstanding, I'm not talking about the societal expectations. I mean a person who is truly happy and rooted in himself. And so that's the promise I made, was to be there for him, to support him in that capacity.
And you said it was implicit. It was just kind of the way you lived your life, but there was some thought. I mean, it was a little bit of it had some concreteness to it, but it's interesting how some of these things do kind of evolve, and now you've become more aware of it as a promise. So that's kind of what you're saying, huh? Yeah.
Yeah, well, when I look back on my life, it is. When I look back on the decisions I've made over the last few years since he was born, he's almost 4 now, and I look back on the decisions I've made, I realize I have been keeping him at the center of these decisions. The question, when I've been given the option to prioritize between him and something else, I tune into my heart and I notice, no, what I want is to be with my son, to be supporting him, to be there, to honor the amazing relationship that we've had ever since he was born. A lot of people don't know this, and I haven't discussed this publicly, actually, very much at all.
So we're going to make some news.
And when I think about my son and his birth, what transpired actually was we planned an unassisted home birth, which means that I was the only other person present when he was born. I was acting as the father, as the doctor, midwife, whatever you want to call it, and my promise was to bring him into this world. You know, my promise began before he was even born, and as soon as he came out and he opened his eyes and he looked at me, it was like that promise was solidified. I didn't have words, but it was implicit right there. I've got your back. I'm going to take care of you. You are coming into this world with some wings underneath you already. And that was the promise. That was the moment where I really knew where my life was going with him. That connection was so deep, so fast, instantly. Just looking at one another. I was the first person he saw in the world.
Right. Wow. That's amazing. Now, let me just share quickly. Yeah. No, that starts the process going, but you knew it. It was like a heart sort of connection. You saw it in his eyes, and your eyes met. Obviously, I don't know what a little tiny baby like that would actually see, but there's an emotional connection. Now, I'll just share this because I was given permission to share this story. I won't go into details, but a name you'll recognize, Chris, and people listening will know, John Assaraf, has been interviewed for this book, The Power of Making a Promise, and he's given me permission to talk about the promise that he made. I don't want to give it all away because it's really moving, but it has something to do with this. With the birth of his first child, he made, in effect, a promise to God, and he did it explicitly. He knew when this birth took place that he was going to, that God had been taking care of his boy, his little infant, inside the womb. And at birth, it is now John Assaraf's role to take care of this child, this human being, this new person. And so he made a promise to God at this sort of a handoff. Now it's my job, this kind of thing. And again, I'll go into more detail in the book. But it was really moving the way he thought of that. And it reminds me a lot of what you're talking about, that moment where there's kind of a handoff, and you're now in charge. Yeah. So I just wanted to share that because John Assaraf really was kind enough to share that story for the book, and again I'll go into more detail later. But so that's the emotional connection. That's the responsibility you felt at that moment of birth, and then since then, what's been happening?
Since then, I have. In the corporate world where I was for several years, I was given the opportunity to take several promotions and keep moving up the ladder. I kept getting stellar performance reviews, and every time I was given that opportunity after my son was born, I turned those opportunities down because they would mean more travel and less time to be with him, to support him. And so I turned down many promotions. And on top of that, I did start working from home more when he was born, even though I only lived literally 2 miles away from the office. I chose to work from home as much as I could and continued that trend of traveling less when I was given the choices of how far to travel, how much to travel. I would do my best to find ways to ensure that I'd be closer to my son as frequently as possible. And then leaving the corporate world, although that was very much a promise to myself and a promise to the world to bring my gifts to the world, it was also a promise to him that, again, I would not take the metaphorical promotions, that I would stay true to being there for him and build my business in a way that I could work from home and still be there with him as much as I could, every day of the week, at least until the divorce, and then it was a promise to be there to the best of my abilities. And so every time there was this opportunity, again, there was a trip that I had, was able to get some free tickets to a $2,000 event where the main speaker, or one of the main speakers, would introduce me to about half of the speakers on stage. This is the Engage Today event. And I was given an amazing opportunity. And when I looked at the context of my life, and I knew I was going to be traveling already a few days before that, and this would add a few more days onto it, at a really just a tough time, I decided, no, this is not in alignment with my promise. This is not what my heart really wants. It would be amazing for my business, and it would launch me and build some phenomenal connections, and that opportunity will come again. But the moment to be here with my son while he's growing up, before he starts spreading his wings and is off on his own, this is a unique time. And so to stay true to that promise with him, I've turned down opportunities like that as well. Another big one that just happened literally this month is due to forces definitely far beyond my control. I have moved to Texas from where I lived in Oregon, and the whole reason was because his mom was moving to Texas for her own reasons that she had to be here. And I said, you know what, I'm not comfortable being this far away from my son. I'm moving. And so I completely picked up the life that I had been building in Portland, moved to Texas, and now I am building a new life here, still with him at the center of it, getting to see him every day, which is amazing.
Wow. So that's with a promise comes all kinds of activities and commitments and sometimes inconveniences. And if you look at it from the point of view of what society might expect. I mean, or you turn down opportunities, and now you've moved. I don't know how many miles, 1,500 miles or something to Texas. That's a big move to keep that promise, to keep that center of your life in the center of your life, and that's a pretty powerful way to really talk about this power of making a promise. You have made a commitment, Chris, and you're living it every day, and that's where the power of making a promise, I think, helps people stay on track. And we can talk a little bit more about this. That as opposed to a goal. Now, a relationship with a son may be a unique sort of situation where the promise just really confirms and kind of underscores the linkage, the emotional connection, and makes it even more powerful. But a lot of people make other choices, and you've made this very strong and commendable choice to be in your son's life on a daily basis. So I commend you for that. That's very inspiring.
Thank you.
And
he inspires me.
That wasn't yeah.
Yeah, it's very mutual. He inspires me, and I inspire others, and it all keeps just circling more and more inspiration and more people keeping and making promises.
Yeah, making make a promise, keep your word, what you're doing, change your life, which is obviously happening, transform the world. That comes into play because as you are inspired more by keeping your promise and you're empowered more by doing it, you're now finding ways to inspire other people. Maybe you didn't go to that one conference or that one opportunity, but you have other opportunities. And by keeping your word, you're more your integrity is a little bit stronger, you're more inspiring, more inspirational. So you're better at inspiring others as a result of that promise, if I can put it that way, if that makes sense. I think it
does. And also the work that I do in my life, both from a spiritual development perspective as well as the business, is very much inspired by my son. And there's actually going to be some bodies of work that I'll be developing in addition to already having written some articles and emails and blog posts relating to my son and what I've learned. I'm actually going to be building some real work, probably a book in this space around parenting and what's unfolded with this relationship with my son. So there's a lot more deepening from this promise that will come into the world than just the relationship I have with my son.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that will benefit others, and that's where a promise, I think, gets to linking up a promise with your purpose is one of the things I talk about. If people talk about what's your purpose, what's your passion, and if you can link into that your promise, it's a huge advantage in terms of your energy and focus. And a promise linked to your purpose, I think, is sort of where you're sort of leading this conversation to really a very wonderful place, and that is, make sure that your promise is in line with your purpose. And I think that's part of what you're saying, isn't it?
It is. In fact, when you first started this call, and I was just listening to you talk, one thing that came to mind, and I took a note of this because I didn't want to lose track of it. I knew we would intuitively come back to this, and that is I wrote a purpose statement a few years ago, and I've done small tweaks and refinements to it over the last few years, but it really has kept its essence. And when I started reading and thinking of this purpose statement while you were talking, I realized I could replace the word promise with purpose. I could just swap them. It was totally interchangeable in my experience. So here I'll go ahead and read to you my purpose statement, which is, my purpose is to use insight, compassion, and the rapid embodiment of wisdom to enable millions of people to experience inner peace, joy, and abundance. It works equally with promise. It's exactly the same with promise, only it even goes deeper, like you said, because it's no longer this sort of purpose guidance. The promise, in the way that you talk about promises, brings that to a much more internalized, implicit state, which I think is very interesting.
I don't know if you saw this, Chris, but I have something I call the GPS success system, which I'll mention. I don't think I've mentioned on the air before, but the GPS success system is basically, the G is goals, the P is promises, equals success. If you go from goals to promises, you're going to move towards success, and that the GPS system, like a navigation system, sort of keeps you on track over time. And that's one of the things that you've described with your son and the promise to your son and your career and your purpose. And it's just a way to keep on track in the direction of where you really want to go. And that's the GPS system in action. And, it would have been easy, Chris, for you to say, I know I made that promise, but I kind of like being in Oregon. I don't really want to move.
Yeah.
Well, as I sign off, I just want to remind people of that the mantra, I call it a mantra, of those 4 sentences. Make a promise, keep your word, change your life, transform the world. And that's where the Gandhi idea of be the change you want to see in the world. I think there's the first step might be to make the promise to be the change you want to see in the world.